Today is January 30th, 2021, and it has now been almost an entire year since the World Health Organization first declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. This took place on March 11th, 2020, after COVID-19 had been spreading to people for over 2 months. Because this virus first started spreading to people at the end of 2019, and the last couple of months of 2019, that's when people in China started getting this virus. But then starting in January of 2020, starting in January and February, but it really got a lot worse in March. That's when this virus started spreading to other countries, and that's also when this virus started spreading to the United States. The first person to get infected from COVID 19, that was on January 20th. That was when the first ever COVID 19 case in the United States was reported. Throughout January and February, there were barely any cases, but then March 2020 is when it got really bad. That's when we went from around 100 cases to 100,000 cases. So the number of cases in March increased by a giant amount. And since March 2020 was almost a year ago, it is now January 30th, 2021, like I said. February 2021 is almost here, which means that it has been almost a year since this pandemic first started spreading to the United States, and almost a year since this disease was first declared a pandemic. So, in this video, I would like to talk about the United States specifically, some of the numbers relating to COVID 19 in the United States. This video will be specifically focused on COVID 19 in the United States. Like I said in my previous video, my previous COVID 19 update, I would like to keep these videos shorter from now on, 5 to 8 minutes, maybe 10 minutes maximum. But let's get started with this now. One of the reasons why I decided to make this video today is because we unfortunately, in the United States, we just hit 450,000 deaths caused by COVID 19. That's actually an extremely high number. That's just really sad to think about. I remember back in May of last year, May 2020, near the end of that month, that's when we first hit 100,000 deaths. And already then, that was a very depressing amount. That was a staggeringly high number of deaths. But now we're at 4 times that what we had in May of 2020. We're at 450,000 deaths, and sometime in February we're going to hit 500,000 deaths. That's what all the projection models predict, that sometime in February we're going to hit 500,000 deaths. The reason why we have such a high death count now is because of the past couple of months. The daily death count started to increase by a lot in late November, early December. See, in September and October last year, September and October 2020, we only had around 1,000 deaths per day on average, but once you got to November, that quickly increased to almost 3,000 deaths per day. And by the time you got to the second half of December, it was beyond 3,000 deaths per day. And then by the time we got to January this month, January 2021, that's when it got all the way up to 4,000 deaths per day. Since the number of deaths per day increased so much in the last 2 months, that's why we quickly went from 300,000 to 450,000 deaths. Because we hit the 300,000 death mark at on January not January on December 11th, 2020. That's when the United States first hit 300,000 deaths, and it only took a month and a half approximately to get another 150,000 deaths. That just shows how deadly this virus has been for the United States in the past month and a half. So unfortunately, we're at 450,000 deaths in total now in the United States because of COVID-19. We're also at 26.65 million cases in total, 26 million COVID-19 cases in the United States in total. Once again, that number increased by a large amount in the past 2 months. September, the number of cases per day started to decrease by quite a lot. In October is when it started to increase again. See, the daily case count throughout August was only around 50,000 cases per day approximately, and in September it was only around 40,000, even lower than that. But then once you got to October, that's when things started to get bad, especially in the second half, because at the start of October you had around 50,000 cases per day, but at the end of October, that doubled to around 100,000 cases per day. But it only got worse from there because by the end of November, we had over 150,000 cases per day, and by the time you got to the middle of December, you had 200,000 cases per day. Then it was at its absolute worst in early January. That's when we had 300,000 cases in a single day. The absolute worst day throughout this entire pandemic for the United States was January 8th, 2021, when we had 308,000 new cases of COVID-19 just on that day itself. But after January 8th, it looks like things started to get quite a bit better. So in the past few weeks, it looks like things have actually been improving quite a bit, but we're still at a really bad situation, especially when compared to spring and summer of last year. At its peak, in the summer of last year, we had 75,000 cases per day, but even now, when we've had a consistent decrease in the daily case count for the past 2, 3 weeks, we're still at around 150,000 cases per day, which is twice what we had at the peak of the second wave in the last summer, in summer of 2020. So that just shows how much worse this third wave of the pandemic has been compared to the previous two waves. The first wave was in the spring of 2020. That's when we had around not that many cases per day actually. It was only around 30,000 cases per day, which is still quite a lot, but it's barely anything compared to now. We had 30 to 40,000 cases per day in the spring. Then in the summer, in comparison to the spring, it was a lot worse. That's when we had around 60 to 70,000 cases per day, but compared to now, that was practically a cakewalk. At least looking in hindsight, that was nothing compared to what we're dealing with now. So we had 70,000 cases per day, then it decreased to 40,000 in August and September, 40,000 per day, and then throughout October, November, December, it went all the way up to 250,000 to 300,000 per day. So we're in the worst wave of this pandemic, but it looks like we're just now starting to get past the third wave. We're just now starting to recover. We were at the peak of the third wave in early January, in the first couple of weeks of this month. Same with the daily death count. It looks like we're just now starting to see a slight decrease. It was the absolute worst. The death count per day was at its absolute worst in the first half of this month when we had around 4,000 deaths per day for a couple of weeks. But now we're starting to see that decrease by a bit, but we're still at a really alarming amount of deaths per day with around 3,500 deaths per day. Yesterday, for reference, we had 3,685 deaths. That was January 29th, 2021. And it appears today that we've had 2,889 deaths. Today is January 30th, 2021. So it looks like in the upcoming weeks, it looks like the daily death count is going to decrease by quite a bit. At least that's what appears to be. That's what it looks like is going to happen in the upcoming weeks, especially when you consider that the daily case count has been decreasing for the past few weeks. And usually there's a lag between a decrease in the daily case count or an increase in the daily case count and a decrease/increase in the daily death count, because whenever somebody gets the virus, whenever someone gets COVID-19, they don't usually die in the only couple days after getting it. Usually, if they're going to die from the virus, it takes a few weeks of that patient being seriously ill before they actually pass away from the virus. So that's why you usually see around a 3 week period of lag between an increase or decrease in the daily case count and an increase or decrease in the daily death count. Like for the second wave of this pandemic in the United States, the wave we had in the summer of last year, summer 2020, you started seeing a massive increase in the daily case count throughout the United States sometime in the middle of June, but the increase in the daily death count in the United States didn't actually appear in the data until the beginning of July. So there was a 2 to 3 week period of delay between an increase in the daily case count and death count back in the summer, and I expect that that's what's going on right now. But instead of an increase, we're seeing a decrease in the daily case count and hopefully a decrease in the daily death count. I'm really hoping that the decrease in the daily case count that we've had in the past couple of weeks will also translate to a decrease in the daily death count, because 4,000 deaths per day is actually such a depressing number of people to think about. That's literally more people per day dying from COVID-19 than the number of people that died from 9/11. Because 9/11 unfortunately took the lives of around 3,000 people, but we're seeing even more than that, more people than that die every day from COVID-19. And we've seen more people than 3,000 die every day from COVID-19 for the past month and a half at this point. We first hit the 3,000 deaths per day mark at around December 10th, 2020, December 11th, 2020. That's when we first crossed the 3,000 deaths in a single day threshold. And ever since then, we've had almost every single day see that many deaths or more from COVID-19. So I'm hoping that soon, in a few weeks from now, or even a couple weeks from now, we can finally get below 3,000 deaths. And I'm hoping that the vaccine distribution will really help to decrease not only the daily case count, but also the daily death count in the upcoming weeks. Last thing I'm going to talk about before I end this video is the states that are doing the worst with COVID-19, both in terms of the absolute number of people that have the virus and the percentage of each state that has had the virus. So, in terms of absolute numbers, the states that are doing the worst with COVID-19 are California, Texas, Florida, and New York, but that's really not surprising when you consider that those are the states with the most number of people. California at this point in time has 3.3 million cases in total throughout this pandemic. Texas is 2.37 million. Florida is 1.71 million. And New York is 1.44 million. So those four states have the most people out of every state in the United States. They're also the four states with the most COVID cases that have had the most COVID cases throughout this pandemic. No surprise there. In terms of number of deaths, New York is still number one in terms of the total number of deaths, with 43,000 deaths from COVID 19 in total, but California is not far behind with 40,000 deaths. Texas is in third place with 37,000 deaths. Florida is quite a ways behind with 26,000 deaths. I really hope that California doesn't pass New York. I don't want more people to die from this virus. We've already had so many deaths. It's just really sad to think about. Last thing I'm going to talk about is the number of cases per 1 million people in each state, aka the percentage of the population in each state that has gotten COVID 19. So, the state that has had the highest percentage of its population get COVID 19 is North Dakota. At this point in time, around 12.8% of the population is tested positive for the virus, which means that almost certainly even more people than that has actually gotten the virus, because some people get the virus but never actually get tested for it. So the number of cases in that state are underreported as a result. North Dakota's at 12.8%, South Dakota's at 12.2%, Rhode Island's at 10.8%, Utah's at 10.7%, and Tennessee's at 10.6%. In total, there are 7 states in the United States that have had over 10% of the residents test positive for COVID 19. Throughout the entire United States, around 8% of the United States population has now tested positive for COVID 19. And it also appears that 0.13% of the United States population has died from COVID 19, which is actually very disturbing to think about and very sad to think about. The fact that out of every 1,000 people living in the United States, around 13 of those people have died sometime in the past year from COVID 19. I believe that COVID 19 in the United States and across the entire world was actually one of the leading causes of death throughout 2020, which is actually very indicative of how dangerous and how deadly this virus actually is. The fact that it became one of the leading causes of death throughout the United States and across the planet in 2020, and it might also be the case that COVID 19 is a leading cause for death at least across the planet, but also possibly in the United States in 2021. It really depends on how fast we can get these vaccines distributed, because this pandemic is not going to end until we get the vaccines distributed.